Top 25 poll earlier for you, but what will the new college football playoff rankings look like? Well, here's what our own Brad Crawford predicts the new rankings will look like come Tuesday. These are not his final rankings. Something that does stand out here, Brad still has BYU in the top 12 at 10, even after their loss to Kansas this weekend. In the SEC, Georgia does move up 3 spots from last week in his rankings, and that is after their win over Tennessee. They're just 1 spot behind Bama and the Vols, still lurking at 12. Meanwhile, the Big Ten, you see there, has 4 of the top 5 spots, Notre Dame at 6. So I'm going to give the floor here first to our own Leger Duzable to kind of pick apart these rankings. And I know, why don't we start with BYU?
Yeah, we already talked about this earlier. Yeah. I don't see BYU being in the top he's got him in the top 10, but in the top 12 period, just because, again, a home loss to Kansas, who, yes, they're currently hot right now, Jordan, but then they don't have a winning record. They essentially have to win out to even become bowl eligible. I think the committee will hold that against them. And I would say, when you look at the ratings, right, and the rankings that we've seen, teams that have been undefeated, right, BYU, Indiana, they don't put them as a top 2 or 3 team because of schedule or lack thereof, right? So, like, when you look at BYU, right, they do have a good out-of-conference win versus SMU, but then when you look at the Big 12, it's not as strong as some of these other conferences like the Big 10 or the SEC. So when you lose to a team that doesn't have a winning record, I think the committee will punish them for that.
All right, how about number 8 there? Alabama ahead of Georgia. Have a problem with that, or is that just right?
No, that's right, because Alabama beat them head-to-head. Yep. Right? It's hard for you to put a team ahead of a team that beat you head-to-head when you guys have essentially the same record. So have no issue with that again.
But just 1 spot behind them? You have no issue?
Yeah, I don't have an issue with that at all. Again, then Ole Miss 2 spots behind them. Even though Ole Miss did beat Georgia head-to-head, they took a bad loss to Kentucky early in the year. So I think that's justifiable right now, Brad, having Ole Miss right there at 11 and Bama at 8 and 9. But I think SMU should be in the top 12. I honestly do. When you look at it, again, now, BYU could hurt them going down the stretch if BYU continues this trend of playing with fire and continuing to lose games. Then that could hurt that loss SMU took to them. But SMU, again, is one of the most complete teams in all of football. I think they've been punished because they're in the ACC. Again, if they were in the Big 12, again, who knows what their record would be. But look at Indiana, right? They're into top 5 because they're undefeated, and they haven't played the strength of the Big 10, but they're not getting punished for it. I don't think SMU should be punished for that as well.
So when the first playoff rankings came out 2 weeks ago, a lot of us argued that BYU was underrated at number 9, right? So last week, the committee corrected itself from the first rankings, putting BYU 6.
Yep.
So now after the Cougars' first loss, I just think they're going to keep them in that 10-11 range. And right now, I think the team on the outside looking in is Tennessee. I've got them 12, but we know Boise State's going to get that G5 bid. That's going to knock Tennessee out. So really, Tennessee, in my opinion, was the big loser in Week 12 because they had a chance to go to Athens. They were only one of 3 SEC teams, with Texas and A&M being the other 2, in control of their own destiny still. But Nico and that offense could not get it done against Georgia. So I've got Tennessee slipping. I've got BYU falling from 6 to 10. And I still think, even though the Big 12 is going to be a one big league, BYU wins out, they're going to be in.
Yeah, Brad, so it's funny.
I'm not predicting it, though.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to win out either. They've been playing with fire this whole season. Funny thing is, I don't know if you remember, it was like 4 or 5 weeks ago, I put a scenario out there that Boise State being one of the top 4 conference champs, right? Just because I knew the scenario with the Big 12 could potentially happen. And now it's actually unfolding between our eyes. So what happens if Boise State is a top 4 conference championship by ranking, right? They get the bye, and that leaves a spot open for another group of 5 team, albeit maybe it's Tulane, maybe it's Army, depending on what happens these next couple games.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. All right, you guys, you know, after the second college football playoff rankings were released, we really got a better idea of how the committee views these teams week after week. Before I get your opinions on what you think the committee will be prioritizing, I do want you to hear what head coach for Georgia, Kirby Smart, had to say. Take a listen to this.
I don't know what they're looking for. I really don't. I wish they could really define the criteria. I wish they could do the eyeball test where they come down here and look at the people we're playing against and look at them. And, you know, you can't see that stuff on a TV. And so I don't know what they look for, but that's for somebody else to decide. I'm worried about our team. They're not in that environment. They're not at Ole Miss in that environment playing against that defense, which is top 5 in the country with one of the best pass rushers in the country, and they're fired up. They got a 2-score lead, and they're coming every play. They don't know that. They don't understand that.
All right, coach doesn't know what the committee is looking for. Brad, do you know? Do you know what they're prioritizing?
Then Kirby, why not make it the SEC Invitational then?
Exactly.
SEC teams in. Look, you can't lose 3 games. If Georgia would have lost to Tennessee last night, I don't care how many quality elite wins they have. 9-3, don't even make your conference championship game. Expect to be in a 12-team playoff. That's not why we expanded the playoff. Is it? I think the committee does look at strength of schedule, but only when it is trying to separate teams of like value. I think we saw last week Indiana at number 5 or 6 right there hovering. Indiana needs to not only play well against Ohio State, just make sure they don't get blown out, because there's a scenario where an 11-1 Indiana may not get in over a 10-2 Texas, 10-2 Tennessee. I know Kirk Cinetti and the Hoosiers don't want to hear that right now, but it's clear that the SEC, Greg Sankey, Kirby Smart now, they're kind of petitioning for this over these next few weeks that, hey, we're in the SEC. We play a tougher schedule than most Big Ten teams do, so it's going to be very interesting here the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, Brad, that was the perfect word to use, right? But I would say, I'd take it a step further. Politicking is what he was doing for the SEC. I know people have talked about 4, maybe 5 SEC teams getting in the top 12, right? And I think the committees will look at strength of schedule, right? That will be a real thing. Indiana, to your point, right, they're up against it when it comes to that. So they can't get boat raced by Ohio State in Columbus this week coming up. They have to make it look good. Now, you don't hear coaches often say, we had a good loss, right? There's no such thing as a good loss. There's no moral victories, right? And that's why Indiana's at the spot where they're at, because they've won every week. Like, you can say what you want about their schedule. They've actually made it look pretty easy besides that one Michigan game. Everybody else, they boat race. So I have no problem with them being that high, but I think the committee will factor in strength of schedule. And it'll be interesting, right? If Indiana does go on to lose to Ohio State, right? How do they match that up between a 2-loss Tennessee, a 2-loss Georgia, or a 2-loss Ole Miss? It'll be interesting to see.
Well, I think you brought up a good point earlier, and it makes sense that it's hard to win.
It's hard.
In any conference, week after week.
You should be congratulated for that.
Exactly. Yeah, and we saw exactly kind of what happened with BYU, but it's clear that we did see the committee with the second playoff rankings that were released this past Tuesday favor the SEC with 5 teams in the rankings. All right, before we go to break, some important college football dates to highlight here. Here are the dates you need to know. Selection Sunday is December 8th, with the first round of the college football playoff beginning on December 20th, and with the national title game on January 20th. That is it. New college football AP Top 25 poll is out after we capped off week 12 of the season. Here's a look at your new top 10 teams. No huge change at the top. Worth mentioning, though, Oregon remains number 1 and has officially clinched a spot in the Big Ten title game that is on CBS this year. Oregon got the close win to Wisconsin yesterday. Most notable, though, you'll see BYU undefeated no more. They fall out of the top 10 after their loss to unranked Kansas. Georgia is back in the top 10 after their win over Tennessee, while the Vols fall the most this week, but still claim that 10th spot. A look now at 11 through 20. No major changes other than, as we mentioned, BYU falling. They claim the 14th spot. You'll see Boise State there at 12. They're ahead of both Colorado and BYU, would be the top teams in the Big 12 right now. South Carolina makes its way into the top 20 as they claimed a 34-30 win against Missouri. And a look at the rest of the teams that do round out the new AP Top 25 poll. You'll notice Kansas State, LSU, Louisville, and Missouri all out of the top 25 rankings. Washington State still in it at 25. We're going to dive into all of this and so much more as we welcome you into our CBS Sports HQ studios. I am Jordan Giorgio alongside Leger Duzable and Brad Crawford joining us from afar. Let's go ahead and start with BYU falling, okay? Were we giving BYU, you guys, a little too much credit? That SMU win that they had seems like forever ago. That Kansas State win is starting to look worse and worse. How are we processing at this moment this BYU team?
Yeah, I think it's hard to win week in and week out. And yes, Jordan, they were muddling around the line of potentially losing the last couple of weeks. You talk about that Utah game the week before. If not for I'm going to go ahead and say it, a bad call, they probably lose that game versus Utah as well. So this is a team that you have to give them credit for winning every week, because Brad and Jordan, we know this, it's hard to win games week in and week out. It's hard to go undefeated no matter who you're playing, especially when you're playing guys in your conference. But they, again, were flirting with losing the last couple of weeks. You see it right there, the Utah game, the UCF game, that Oklahoma State game. Like, they were on the brink of losing all of those games, and it finally came and bit them. But a lot of people were surprised that it came and bit them at home versus a Kansas team that essentially hasn't went out to become
with fire within its conference season. And, you know, 3 close wins in the final seconds. Last week was able to beat Utah on that late field goal. Finally, it came back to haunt BYU, and they lost to a Kansas team that we said last week is starting to streak now with Jalen Daniels at quarterback. The good news for BYU is this, though. 7 spots fallen in the AP Top 25. I do not think the selection committee, the playoffs, is going to drop them 7 spots. I still think BYU will be inside the top 10, might be number 10, but BYU still in good position if the Cougars win out and win the Big 12.
You agree with that?
No way, Brad. I mean, you got to think this is a Kansas team with a losing record. They lost this game at home. I think the committee will consider, like you talked about, even though they were winning games, they were playing with fire these last couple of weeks, right? Again, if a call doesn't go their way on a pivotal 4th down versus Utah, they lose that game last week. Now, potentially, we're looking at 2 losses for BYU. But it went the other way. They were able to kick that field goal late and win that game. But when you lose to a team that doesn't even have a winning record, like, there has to be some payment for that, right? It's not like they lost to a team that's ranked and they barely lost. Just like we saw, and we'll probably talk about this later, Tennessee losing to Georgia. Like, they probably won't fall out of the top 12 because that was a close game at the end. Yes, you know, Nico fumbles the ball late in the 4th quarter. The game was essentially already over. But this, Brad, was a team they lost to in Kansas that doesn't have a winning record. So, again, people had already kind of scoffed at their schedule or lack thereof when it comes to playing a competitive schedule, because the Big 12 has had an up and down year in regards to there's really no true alpha in the Big 12. And then, again, it's the SMU game is a big win for them, but it was so early in the season when Kevin Jennings essentially wasn't even the starting quarterback at the time. So I think the committee will fault them for this loss against Kansas at home, losing in the way that they did.
Well, maybe not a winning record, but have won 4 in a row. They're kind of breaking hearts left and right. And, you know, they'll see Kansas, I'm talking about here. We'll see Colorado next week. And the Buffaloes better be careful because Kansas still has something to play for, and that's bowl eligibility.
Correct.
So we will see Tuesday. Brad, if you're correct, or maybe if you're correct, Lige, let's move on here. You alluded to it, the big game in the SEC yesterday. It was Tennessee and Georgia out in Athens. The Dogs, you know, we saw them take down #1 Texas earlier in the season. They now beat Tennessee. Are you sold that Georgia right now has the best resume in the SEC right now?
When you talk about the teams they've played, yes, because they've had like the hardest schedule, but I'm not sold on Georgia at all. It's because they have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at quarterback, right? When you talk about Carson Beck, like, yes, he looked really good yesterday versus Tennessee, but let's not forget, let's go back to the Ole Miss game. Looked abysmal in that game. Let's go back to the first half versus Bama. Looked really bad that game, and then had some big throws late, but then ended up having that costly turnover at the end of the game. So the thing is, week in and week out, but I don't trust the quarterback right now.
Yeah, Brad, are you on the same page with Lige here? Are you not sold that the turnover issues aren't going to be a problem from here on out for Carson Beck and company?
If Georgia had a strong running game and the offensive line was playing better than it is right now, I wouldn't be worried about Carson Beck. However, Georgia at times is one-dimensional, and you can only ask that defense of Kirby Smart's to do so much. Played well enough in the second half last night to beat Tennessee. I think right now, Jordan, you're looking at 2 fan bases, Georgia and Tennessee. Tennessee fans, I think, should be a little bit worried because that's probably going to be a 10-2 team. But will the committee take a 5th SEC team, or is an 11-1 Indiana and 11-1 Penn State going to get that bid, and then you have a 4-4 situation? So Tennessee had a chance last night to really punch its ticket, I think, in my opinion, to the playoff. But, man, they really struggled offensively. And Georgia, however, now has a couple elite wins. And I think Georgia, as long as they win out and beat Georgia Tech here in a couple weeks, they're going to be in.
Can I tell you, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a 5th SEC team in there, though. We'll wait and see. But that's a great point, Brad. All right, let's get to the ACC here. Clemson got a huge win over Pitt. If you look at their remaining games left, Brad, they play Citadel and South Carolina. Is there a path for Clemson to stay alive here?
Clemson does not control its own destiny in this playoff picture. I think if they finish 9-3, even with 2 good wins, blowing out Citadel and beating a pretty good South Carolina team, I think Clemson's a top 20 team. They have to have Miami lose another game. Miami's going to be a double-digit favorite the next 2 weeks as well. So right now you have 3 teams still kind of competing for those 2 spots in the ACC, but you see it right there. I mean, Miami has a pretty much cakewalk unless Syracuse and Kyle Ford are able to win that game inside the Carrier Dome. I really think we're going to see SMU, Miami square off in Charlotte here in a couple weeks. And I think I've been saying it for a month now. The ACC is going to be a 1-bid playoff league, and the winner of that SMU-Miami game here in a few weeks is going to the playoff.
Yeah, Brad, I agree with you. I think when Miami ended up losing that game 2 weeks ago, that's what literally put the nail in the coffin for the ACC and potentially having 2 teams. Clemson doesn't control their own destiny, and I'll take it a step further. I don't think they're going to win that South Carolina game. I mean, I don't think there's a hotter team in football right now than South Carolina. And we're talking about teams that could potentially get in at the back. And a lot of people are saying South Carolina, right? If they finish their business, right, they have an outside chance to potentially get in, which is crazy to think about, Brad, right? A 3-loss SEC team potentially getting into the playoffs. I'm looking forward to Miami and SMU in that conference championship game. I think not enough people are talking enough about SMU. They are one of the most complete teams in all of college football. And yes, I know they had a really close game versus Boston College, but you know this, Brad and Jordan, when you have a quarterback change, sometimes you get a bump of energy, and that's what happened with Boston College. But when they needed Kevin Jennings in that offense to make plays at the end, when they needed that defense to come away with a crucial sack, 4th down, backed up with Boston College driving the football, they were able to do that. So when you talk about a complete team, offense and defense and special teams, SMU is one of those top teams. I think they need to stop being disrespected. They are going to be a sleeper when it comes down the stretch.